Lamplight Universe presents Treasure Hunters, a Kingdom of Florida adventure. Chapter 3, Shadowpeople.
Jeanmarc and I spent the next hour or more in conversation, sharing all that had transpired in the months since our fateful shipwreck. As I have already transcribed the adventures upon which I met my dearest Coral, I will spare you most of the details here. Jeanmarc, however, shared a less fortunate story. Jeanmarc's remnants of driftwood carried him until the currents died down. At some point, he recalled waking in the clear shallows just offshore of what we've now dubbed the Island of Monkeys. The weary crewman paddled the rest of the way to the beach, where he immediately began to search for food and sustenance. As he was accustomed to island life, Jeanmarc was able to easily find drink in the form of coconuts, which grew in plentiful numbers there, and food through foraging of berries and tropical fruit. This was the point at which he discovered the dream-inducing pink fruit, which quickly became a favorite treat of his and an amusing pastime. The majority of his days passed uneventfully until he came upon an abandoned hut, wherein he discovered a plethora of supplies, including a machete, powdered spices, and a chest of gold doubloons. At last, he perceived that his fortunes had shifted. Though he had lost everything in the wreck, he now bore witness to a valuable treasure. This, he hoped, would allow him to buy passage back to our home, to his family, if only a vessel were to pass by. That day, when he was hauling the treasure to the beach, he wandered through the jungle. A troop of pesky monkeys appeared and began to taunt him. So much so that Jeanmarc became irritated and began to dance and shout to make them stop. This only encouraged the creatures, and soon they descended upon him and carried all of the gold doubloons away into the trees, one piece at a time. The rest of his days on the island were full of little excitement. Dejected and defeated, Jeanmarc was ready to give up, until he thought of his family back home, likely worried that he was no longer living.
I would do anything to be back there with them.
Jeanmarc added, lowering his head.
With Marie, with my boys. Why, I'm sure I've missed so much. The youngest was not even a year old when we left.
I placed a comforting hand on Jeanmarc's shoulder. They'll be there when we return. It sounded trite, but I meant it. We were going to return home, to the other world. The somber moment was interrupted by a shout from Ginger off the ship's prow.
Ahoy!
We'd reached the next island, but there was something amiss, for the remainder of the crew began to stare ahead with their mouths agape. I hurried to Ginger's side, where Coral met me, and looked across the rippling waters. The sun shone brightly above us, just barely beginning to slink into an early afternoon descent. But directly in front of the Queen Lily was a sight that gave me pause. I finally understood what had filled the crew with rapt attention. It was an island, just like the others in most respects, except that this isle was shrouded in a thick, dark mist. In actuality, it appeared more like a great shadow. There was no logical explanation for why a mass of land should be cloaked in darkness on such a sunny afternoon. The only logical possibility, if it could even be called that, was magic. Cautiously, we sailed onward, slowing as we approached, for the shadow mist extended beyond the edge of the island into the shallows, and it became difficult to know whether our vessel might be dashed upon unseen rocks.
I don't think anything could survive in such darkness,
Coral mused. But for the sake of Jeanmarc and the possibility that Caesar or Thatcher could still be out there, I persisted. Reluctantly, we gathered into the rowboat once more and made our way to the dark beach. I don't know if I expected the mist to carry a poison or toxin, but it seemed to have little effect on us as it engulfed our small craft and quickly blocked out the light of the sun. Bastian produced a small lantern, which reminded me of the symbol on Coral's family ring, and granted enough light for us to see a few feet ahead of the boat. Finally, we landed on the shore and stepped out. The sand was coarse and black, like gritty, granulated charcoal. Immediately, I regretted the decision to come ashore, but I knew that the lives of my missing friends depended on it. We moved on through the thick blackness and came to a dense jungle. Bastian continued to lead us as we traversed a narrow, weathered path through the trees. On the previous islands, we'd heard all manner of animals and critters in the forest, but here everything was still and quiet. It was like nothing I had ever experienced, and it made my heart and mind uneasy. On we trudged until Bastian motioned for us to stop.
Footsteps,
he whispered as quietly as could be. We swiveled around and tried not to breathe for fear of alerting to our presence whatever phantasm lurked beyond. Then, as we returned our gaze ahead of us along the path, we discovered that several figures now stood before us, watching us in silence. Herein I will describe these individuals in great detail, for the manner in which they were shrouded was unlike anything I had ever seen. These people, men and women, were cloaked in long, billowing tunics of a purplish dye, sewn with flecks of silver that sparkled like stars. Their skin was painted blue and also dotted with something like salt that gave a similar astral shimmer. Altogether, the characters resembled voluminous, dark clouds in night skies hovering before us silently. While we waited for these specters to speak, another figure appeared, nudging his way through the others to get a better look at us. Though he also wore the garb of the shadowy men and women, his face bore a strange resemblance to someone I used to know.
Thatcher?
Jeanmarc recognized him at the same time.
Is it really you?
His words were met with a hurried shushing from Thatcher and his posse, urging us to be quiet as their heads whipped this way and that, to listen for some unseen enemy that may have overheard us. Thatcher pointed at Bastian's lamp and motioned for him to lower it. Our large guide hesitantly obliged. When it was determined that we had not been heard, Thatcher stepped forward and placed a hand first on Jeanmarc's cheek, then on mine. In the remaining glint of Bastian's lamp, I thought I saw a glistening tear form at the corner of his eye before he whispered,
"It's real. It brings my heart great joy to see you, but we must not linger."
With a hurried hug, he gestured toward the path, where his silent companions had already begun to retreat in the way they'd come. With little hesitation, our party, which at this point consisted of myself, Coral, Bastian, Ginger, Jeanmarc, and the remaining crew members, followed further into the darkness. Soon we arrived at the mouth of a cave. A long, wide cloth covered the entire gap, fashioned of the same material as the garments of the strangers we followed. One of them pushed the sheet aside like a curtain and ushered us into the misty cave. Inside, we were greeted with the savory aromas of freshly cooked food, though we could see no fire. We sensed a commotion as dozens more silent, painted individuals noticed our arrival and seemed to be enamored by the lamp that Bastian carried. One whispered something to the leader of the pack, who turned quickly and made motions with his hands that I interpreted as some sort of unspoken language. Thatcher came close to me and muttered, almost unintelligibly,
"The lamp. They're afraid it may be too bright."
"Too bright?" I whispered my reply.
"Yes."
My long-lost companion answered,
"Afraid it may attract the wilder."
My mind was spinning with questions, but Thatcher grabbed my wrist and pulled me further into the narrow cave. We rounded a corner where I sensed a slight relief from the tension and secrecy. Here, the people seemed freer to speak in hushed tones and less frightened of being heard by whatever this mysterious wilder was.
Please, sit.
Thatcher instructed us as we gathered around an unlit fire pit. With Bastian's permission, our old friend placed the lamp in the center of the pit and sat back down. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to speak, this time just above a whisper.
It is truly a sight for sore eyes to see you, my old friends.
He nodded to me and Jeanmarc.
You and your companions are most welcome here.
At this point, we gave quick, quiet introductions. Koro spoke up.
I'm sorry, but where is here exactly?
You are among the Oscura,
Thatcher answered.
Shadowpeople, as we are sometimes called. When I washed ashore on the dark sands of this island, the Oscura rescued me and nursed me back to health. For several months now, I have been living among them, once as a stranger, but now as one of their people.
And Caesar? I hesitated, almost too scared to ask about the fate of our crewmate, and even more afraid to hear the answer. Did he wash up here too? Thatcher paused for far too long before finally answering with a shake of his head.
No. Caesar and I drifted near one another for some time, but the waters drove us apart just before I hit the stream that brought me here. I presume it carried him further south.
I had hoped our journey would be coming to an end so we could return home with my friends and resume our quest for the gems unhindered. But this put another wrench in our plans.
Why are these shadow people so intent on avoiding sound and light?
Ginger inquired. Thatcher lowered his head for a moment, then faced us once more.
We are afraid,
He said somberly.
There is a great beast that dwells on this island. We call it the Wilder. This fearsome creature lives in darkness and feeds on light. Our light. Just before your arrival, the Wilder snatched a fire from our last camp and some of our people. And we hurried here to this makeshift shelter with the clothes on our back and skewers of still hot foragings. We live in fear of the next time it will strike.
That's dreadful,
said Coral. We all sympathized with their plight, but I turned our attention back to our purpose there, rescuing Thatcher and getting off the island as quickly as possible. Thatcher shook his head.
I cannot go. Not while the Wilder lurks and looms over the good people who took me in.
Realizing that our old friend would not be easily swayed, I consulted with my companions and offered a deal. If we help you subdue this great Wilder, then will you come with us? We must bring you back to the place where we belong, back home. With a whisper to a pair of his quiet compatriots, Thatcher returned to us with an answer.
I will agree to this, for though my heart remains here with the Oscura, I must return home to assure my family of my survival.
It's settled then. How do we find this horrid beast? Thatcher lowered his voice, quieter than he'd been up to this point.
We must venture into a still darker place, the Cavern of Wonders.
The Cavern of Wonders. The very name was enough to incite marvel and awe and danger, and it was into this mysterious place that we agreed to venture for the sake of Thatcher's newfound friends. We gathered together a few supplies and weapons, recruited a number of able-bodied Oscura warriors, and began to set out from their temporary camp inside the small cave mouth.
Oh, I nearly forgot.
Thatcher said as he rustled through a pile of loose items that appeared to have been hastily lumped together, likely in the bustle of escaping the last attack of the Wilder. He produced a small necklace upon which a tiny charm was fastened and handed it to Jeanmarc.
I believe this belongs to you. Washed up in the wreckage.
Jeanmarc inspected the charm. It was a tiny golden locket, which he promptly opened to verify its contents. Tears welled up in his eyes as he showed us the two images inlaid within. A woman with a kind, youthful face, and a pair of chubby young children hugging, one still an infant.
Marie, Jean, and Edison, my wife and sons. Thank you, old friend.
Jeanmarc and Thatcher shared a passionate and tearful embrace, as if the very sight of these images instilled in Jeanmarc a new hope that he would see his family again.
Thank you.
He whispered once more. Now ready to leave, we yielded to Thatcher's guidance and issued down the narrow passage back through the curtain at the cave's mouth and out into the shadows of the jungle. It was impossible for us to discern what time of day it was. I presumed that a few hours had passed at most, though it felt like an eternal night. This didn't seem to matter to Thatcher and his warriors, who had grown accustomed to the complete and utter darkness that apparently lingered over this isle at all times. The trek to the Cavern of Wonders led us uphill for a long stretch before we once more descended to what I surmised was sea level. Coral and I remained close to one another, for I feared the thought of losing her in such a vast and bleak place as this one. Bastian kept his lamp low to the ground and covered by a translucent shroud that allowed just enough light for us to see our way forward, but mostly obscured it from a view from any great distance. As we wandered through a particularly humid patch of large-leafed bushes, my feet sank into a few inches of salty mud. I inspected the grime that now caked my shoes, and sensed that our pace had changed.
We're here.
Thatcher announced in a whisper that was repeated quickly down the now single-file line, like in the children's game of telephone. Coral gestured toward the faint outline of a passage ahead of us, another cave mouth, this one much larger and more imposing than the secret hideout of Thatcher's adoptive tribe. This was, without a doubt, the Cavern of Wonders. Bastian offered to put out the lamp, but Thatcher held up a hand to stop him.
We may need it to draw out the Wilder,
he explained. Bastian nodded with understanding. We watched as the glittering garments of the Oscura vanished one by one into the shadows. I took a deep breath, then followed them with my companions. Inside, my feet found no respite from the dampness, for across the floor of the cave was spread a thin layer of water, and I could also discern the faintest rushing and drips echoing off the uneven rocky walls. Our feet splashed lightly, which, I posited, would make it nearly impossible for us to ambush the Wilder unannounced. I was beginning to regret our present expedition.
The beast's ears are weak,
muttered Thatcher, as if to calm my fears.
It can only discern loud and sudden noises, and light, of course.
We continued walking. Presently, the echoes of our sloshing feet were overruled by a shrill shh. The entire party froze in place. When the sonic flurry settled into silence, I perked up my ears, craning this way and that to hear. Then came the sound. First, it was a low, breathy wisp of a sound. Then it grew into a rumble, a guttural, phlegmy growl. It was not unlike the sound one's stomach makes when it's gone without food for some time, only in this case it was multiplied many times over. This was an utterance of the Wilder, I presumed correctly. The rhythm of its rumbling was reminiscent of my grandfather's snoring. The beast was asleep. We rounded a corner and Thatcher spread his arms to prevent us from walking further. Bastian waved the dim lantern in his direction, illuminating the edges of a large, dank hole that seemed to stretch infinitely into the ground. A cool draft emanated from the pit.
The deep void, they call it.
Thatcher whispered.
The Wilder dwells within.
He removed a coiled, thick rope from his shoulder and began to unwind it.
One of us must venture down and slay the beast while it sleeps.
Here our friend withdrew a hefty flint knife, whose hilt was wrapped in strips of dyed purple cloth that matched the garments of the Oscura. After a deafening silence, Coral spoke up.
I will go.
Treasure Hunters, A Kingdom of Florida Adventure is a production of Lamplight Universe, based on the Kingdom of Florida novels by Taylor Thomas Smythe. Treasure Hunters is written and produced by Taylor Thomas Smythe. Starring Femi Kozlowski as Coral, Ben Tidwell as Thatcher, Jedidiah Montalvo as Jeanmarc, Comfort Olugbuyi as Ginger, Ben-Oni Francois as Bastian, and Taylor Thomas Smythe as Jessie. Narrated by Nicole Johnson. Additional voices provided by Ben Tidwell. For more adventures, visit kingdomofflorida.com.